Well, hello beautiful people of planet Earth. It's 11:38 a.m. on the 8th of July 2025 and it's very cold inside the house, so I've put the birdies outside and it's warmer outside than it is inside. Isn't that odd? It's the asbestos walls, I suppose. But anyway, it's a gorgeous day today, absolutely gorgeous, and I thought I'd continue reading from W. Somerset Maugham. So here we are, yet again, at Sacred Space, Titania's realm. Today's story is titled The Creative Impulse. Pop that in that bowl there. I suppose that very few people know how Mrs. Albert Forrester came to write the Achilles statue, and since it has been acclaimed as one of the great novels of our time, I cannot but think that a brief account of the circumstances that gave it birth must be of interest to all serious students of literature, and indeed, if, as the critics say, this is a book that will live, the following narrative, serving a better purpose than to divert an idle hour, may be regarded by the historian of the future as a curious footnote to the literary annals of our day. Everyone, of course, remembers the success that attended the publication of the Achilles statue. Month after month, printers were kept busy printing, binders were kept busy binding, edition after edition, and the publishers, both in England and America, were hard put to it to fulfill the pressing orders of the booksellers. It was promptly translated into every European tongue, and it has been recently announced that it will soon be possible to read it in Japanese and in Urdu. But it had previously appeared serially in magazines on both sides of the Atlantic, and from the editors of these, Mrs. Albert Forrester's agent had wrung a sum that can only be described as thumping. A dramatisation of the work was made, which ran for a season in New York, and there is little doubt that when the play is produced in London, it will have equal success. The film rights have been sold at a great price. Though the amount that Mrs. Albert Forrester is reputed in literary circles to have made is probably exaggerated, there can be no doubt that she will have earned enough money from this one book to save her for the rest of her life from any financial anxiety. How wonderful would that be? And anyway, all my writings are not, they're not in book form, but they're all up on my Facebook and social media. They're just mainly me processing my traumas and my spiritual work and working life out and sometimes working death out and working out defunct relationships. So I do a lot of analysing and processing, coming to terms with what is and what never shall be and what could have been and might have been but got destroyed by envious, spiteful people. So there is that. There's all of that. It's all part of the human condition, is it not? I'm not alone in experiencing all this abject bloody horror. Anyway, as I said, it's a beautiful day. I've got my birdies beside me, and we're happy, aren't we, little Bo? Bo's really happy about his new cage. He's out in his small one because we're outside, but he understood we were going outside today. He let me catch him without too much trouble. You're a good little Bo, aren't you? Yes, you're a good little Bo. So, where were we? Right, carrying on. It is not often that a book meets with equal favour from the public and the critics, and that she, of all persons, had, if I may so put it, squared the circle, must have proved the more gratifying to Mrs. Albert Forrester, since, though she had received the commendation of the critics in no grudging terms, and indeed had come to look upon it as her due, the public had always remained strangely insensible to her merit. Each work she published, a slender volume, beautifully printed and bound in white buckram, was hailed as a masterpiece, always to the length of a column, and in the weekly reviews which you see only in the dusty library of a very long-established club, even to the extent of a page, and well-read persons read and praised it. But well-read persons apparently do not buy books, and she did not sell. It was indeed a scandal that so distinguished an author, with an imagination so delicate and a style so exquisite, should remain neglected of the vulgar. In America she was almost completely unknown, and though Mr. Karl van Vechten had written an article berating the public for its obtuseness, the public remained callous. Her agent, a warm admirer of her genius, had blackmailed an American publisher into taking 2 of her books by refusing, unless he did so, to let him have others, trashy novels doubtless, that he badly wanted, and they had been duly published. The reception they received from the press was flattering, and showed that in America the best minds were sensitive to her talent. But when it came to the 3rd book, the American publisher, in the coarse way publishers have, told the agent that any money he had to spare he preferred to spend on synthetic gin. Never heard of synthetic gin. Does he mean cheap gin? Probably means cheap gin. What's synthetic gin, Bo? I don't know. I'm a cockatiel. I've never drunk gin. Neither have I. I don't like bitter things in my mouth. Bitter, bitter, bitter. There's enough bitterness running through my body that I could manufacture my own fucking gin. But my blood's worth bottling, you understand. Also, I don't stay in bitter consciousness for very long. Right, where were we? Confused by synthetic gin. Right. It's a bit like that, people of Earth, when you come to my channel. Since the Achilles statue, Mrs. Albert Forrester's previous books have been republished, and Mr. Karl van Vechten has written another article pointing out sadly, but firmly, that he had drawn the attention of the reading world to the merits of this exceptional writer fully 15 years ago, and they have been so widely advertised that they can scarcely have escaped the cultured reader's attention. It is unnecessary, therefore, for me to give an account of them, and it would certainly be no more than cold potatoes after those two subtle articles by Mr. Karl van Vechten. Mrs. Albert Forrester began to write early. Her first work, a volume of elegies, appeared when she was a maiden of 18, and from then on she published every 2 or 3 years, for she had too exalted a conception of her art to hurry her production, a volume either of verse or prose. When the Achilles statue was written, she had reached the respectable age of 57, so that it will be readily surmised that the number of her works was considerable. She had given the world 6 volumes of verse, published under Latin titles such as Felicitas, Pax Maris, and Aes Triplex, all of the graver kind, for her muse, disinclined to skip on a light fantastic toe, trod a somewhat solemn measure. She remained faithful to the elegy, and the sonnet claimed much of her attention, but her chief distinction was to revive the ode, a form of poetry that the poets of the present day somewhat neglect. Yes, little boy. And it may be asserted with confidence that her ode to Président Fallières will find a place in every anthology of English verse. It is admirable not only for the noble sonority of its rhythms, but also for its felicitous description of the pleasant land of France. Mrs. Albert Forrester wrote of the valley of the Loire, with its memories of Du Bellay, of Chartres, and the jewelled windows of its cathedral, of the sun-swept cities of Provence, with a sympathy all the more remarkable since she had never penetrated further into France than Boulogne, which she visited shortly after her marriage on an excursion steamer from Margate. But the physical mortification of being extremely seasick, and the intellectual humiliation of discovering that the inhabitants of that popular seaside resort could not understand her fluent and idiomatic French, made her determine not to expose herself a second time to experiences that were at once undignified and unpleasant, and she never again embarked on the treacherous element which she, however, sang, Pax Maris, in numbers both grave and sweet. There are some fine passages too in the Ode to Woodrow Wilson, and I regret that, owing to a change in her sentiments towards that no doubt excellent man, the author decided not to reprint it. Oops, what happened here? Right. But I think it must be admitted that Mrs. Albert Forrester's most distinguished work was in prose. She wrote several volumes of brief but perfectly constructed essays on such subjects as Autumn in Sussex, Queen Victoria, Death, Spring in Norfolk, Georgian Architecture, Monsieur de Diaghilev, and Dante. She also wrote works both erudite and whimsical on the Jesuit architecture of the 17th century and on the literary aspect of the 100 Years' War. It was her prose that gained her that body of devoted admirers, fit, though few. As with her rare gift of phrase, she herself put it, that proclaimed her the greatest master of the English language that this century has seen. She admitted herself that it was her style, sonorous yet racy, both, polished yet eloquent. That was her strong point. Yes, little Kermie. The sun's moved off your cage and it's cold. I have to move you. We'll have to move you, my boys. But it was only in her prose that she had occasion to exhibit the delicious but restrained humour that her readers found so irresistible. It was not a humour of ideas, nor even a humour of words. It was much more subtle than that. It was a humour of punctuation. In a flash of inspiration, she had discovered the comic possibilities of the semicolon, and of this she had made abundant and exquisite use. She was able to place it in such a way that if you were a person of culture with a keen sense of humour, you did not exactly laugh through a horse collar, but you giggled delightedly, and the greater your culture, the more delightedly you giggled. Her friends said that it made every other form of humour coarse and exaggerated. Several writers had tried to imitate her, but in vain. Whatever you might say about Mrs. Albert Forrester, you were bound to admit that she was able to get every ounce of humour out of the semicolon, and no one else could get within a mile of her. We are talking about punctuation, aren't we? Just need to clarify that point. Yes. Yes, little boy. Yes. Mrs. Albert Forrester lived in a flat not far from the Marble Arch, which combined the advantage of a good address and a moderate rent. It had a handsome drawing room on the street and a large bedroom for Mrs. Albert Forrester, a darkish dining room at the back, and a small, poky bedroom next door to the kitchen for Mr. Albert Forrester, who paid the rent. It was in the handsome drawing room that Mrs. Albert Forrester, every Tuesday afternoon, received her friends. What are you banging on about? Who do you see? Are there birdies out there? Wild birdies come to see the bow. Very likely. It was a severe and chaste apartment. On the walls was a paper designed by William Morris himself, and on this, in plain black frames, mezzo tints collected before mezzo tints grew expensive. The furniture was of the Chippendale period, but for the roll-top desk, vaguely Louis XVI 16th in character, at which Mrs. Albert Forrester wrote her works. This was pointed out to visitors the first time they came to see her, and there were few who looked at it without emotion. The carpet was thick and the lights discreet. Mrs. Albert Forrester sat in a straight-backed grandfather's chair covered with red damask. There was nothing ostentatious about it, but since it was the only comfortable chair in the room, it set her apart, as it were, and above her guests. Tea was dispensed by a female of uncertain age, silent and colourless, who was never introduced to anyone, but who was known to look upon it as a privilege to be allowed to save Mrs. Albert Forrester from the irksome duty of pouring out tea. My sister was like that, my half-sister. Used to make me make tea constantly and pour the tea and be the tea lady. And oh, did she throw a tantrum if I didn't immediately go make her a cup of tea. Oh, she was a fucking narcissist like my mother. Oh, narcissism just drips like fetid evil right through the family bloodlines. What can I say? It's revolting. But it's a consequence of childhood trauma, you understand. We must try and, if not forgive them, at least reach some kind of resolution that's how their minds were damaged and their brains wired, and they really are broken, damaged people pretending that they're superior to everyone, i.e. revolting. She was thus able to devote herself entirely to conversation, and it must be admitted that her conversation was excellent. It was not sprightly, and since it is difficult to indicate punctuation in speech, it may have seemed to some slightly lacking in humour, but it was of wide range, solid, instructive, and interesting. Mrs. Albert Forrester was well acquainted with social science, jurisprudence, and theology. She had read much, and her memory was retentive. She had a pretty gift for quotation, which is a serviceable substitute for wit, and having for 30 years known, more or less intimately, a great many distinguished people, she had a great many interesting anecdotes to tell, which she placed with tact, and which she did not repeat more than was pardonable. What do you say to that, little boy? Mrs. Albert Forrester had the gift of attracting the most varied persons, and you were liable at one and the same time to meet in her drawing room an ex-Prime Minister, a newspaper proprietor, and the ambassador of a first-class power. I always imagined that these great people came because they thought that here they rubbed shoulders with Bohemia, but with a Bohemia sufficiently neat and clean for them to be in no danger that the dirt would come off on them. Mrs. Albert Forrester was deeply interested in politics, and I myself heard a cabinet minister tell her frankly that she had a masculine intelligence. She had been opposed to female suffrage, but when it was at last granted to women, she began to dally with the idea of going into Parliament. Her difficulty was that she did not know which party to choose. After all, she said, with a playful shrug of her somewhat massive shoulders, I cannot form a party of one. Right, I'm going to leave you for a few moments. I'm slightly indisposed. I shall return. I shall leave you with a view of the little Bobo. You can tell me what he got up to while I was gone. The little rascal. I'll sit up there now. Let the phone stay there. Hopefully I won't be too long. Oh, why won't that sit? Come on. Right, there you go. I'll be back forthwith. I'm back. I'm just going to move them into the sun a bit more. The whole point of them being out here is to get warmth and sunshine. Warmth and sunshine, my boys. Might move us over too. Sinking into the ground. Oh dear. Right. Set this up so that I'm not falling down. It's not going to work, is it? Annoying. Right, I think that should work. Right, here we are, back again. I've lost my spot because the wind must have blown the pages over while I was indisposed. Let me see. Right, here we are. We paused when she said, "I cannot form a party of one." Thinks a lot of herself, doesn't she? Yes, indeed she does. Maybe she was like me, being ironic or a bit sardonic. It's hard to tell by the text. You'd have to see the facial expressions that went with it. Right. Like many serious patriots, in her inability to know for certain which way the cat would jump, she held her political opinions in suspense. But of late she had been definitely turning towards Labour as the best hope for the country. Just fixing up my slippers. And if a safe seat were offered her, it was felt fairly certain that she would not hesitate to come out into the open as a champion of the oppressed proletariat. Her drawing room was always open to foreigners, to Czechoslovaks, Italians and Frenchmen, if they were distinguished, and to Americans, even if they were obscure. But she was not a snob, and you seldom met there a duke, unless he was of a peculiarly serious turn, and a peeress only if, in addition to her rank, she had the passport of some small social solecism, such as having been divorced, written a novel, or forged a cheque, which might give her claim to Mrs. Albert Forrester's Catholic sympathies. She did not much care for painters who were shy and silent, and musicians did not interest her, even if they consented to play, and if they were celebrated, they were too often reluctant. Their music was a hindrance to conversation. If people wanted music, they could go to a concert. For her part, she preferred the more subtle music of the soul. But her hospitality to writers, especially if they were promising and little known, was warm and constant. She had an eye for budding talent, and there were few of the famous writers who, from time to time, drank a dish of tea with her, whose first efforts she had not encouraged, and those early steps she had not guided. Her own position was too well assured for her to be capable of envy, and she had heard the word genius attached to her name too often to feel a trace of jealousy, because the talents of others brought them a material success that was denied to her. Mrs. Albert Forrester, confident in the judgment of posterity, could afford to be disinterested. With these elements, then, it is no wonder that she had succeeded in creating something as near the French salon of the 18th century as our barbarous nation has ever reached. To be invited to eat a bun and drink a cup of tea on Tuesday was a privilege that few failed to recognise, and when you sat on your Chippendale chair in the discreetly lit but austere room, you could not but feel that you were living literary history. The American ambassador once said to Mrs. Albert Forrester, "A cup of tea with you, Mrs. Forrester, is one of the richest intellectual treats which it has ever been my lot to enjoy." It was indeed, on occasion, a trifle overwhelming. Mrs. Albert Forrester's taste was so perfect, she so inevitably admired the right thing and made the just observation about it, that sometimes you almost gasped for air. For my part, I found it prudent to fortify myself with a cocktail or two before I exposed myself to the rarefied atmosphere of her society. Indeed, I very nearly found myself forever excluded from it, for one afternoon, presenting myself at the door, instead of asking the maid who opened it, "Is Mrs. Forrester at home?" I asked, "Is there divine service today?" Of course it was said in pure inadvertence, but it was unfortunate that the maid sniggered, and one of Mrs. Albert Forrester's most devoted admirers, Ellen Hannaway, happened to be at the moment in the hall taking off her goloshes. She told my hostess what I had said before I got into the drawing room, and as I entered, Mrs. Albert Forrester fixed me with an eagle eye. "Why did you ask if there was divine service today?" she inquired. I explained that I was absent-minded, but Mrs. Albert Forrester held me with a gaze that I can only describe as compelling. "Yes, little handsome boy. Do you mean to suggest that my parties are—" She searched for a word. "Sacramental?" I did not know what she meant, but did not like to show my ignorance before so many clever people, and I decided that the only thing was to seize my trowel and the butter. "Your parties are like you, dear lady, perfectly beautiful and perfectly divine." A little tremor passed through Mrs. Albert Forrester's substantial frame. She was like a man who enters suddenly a room filled with hyacinths. The perfume is so intoxicating that he almost staggers. but she relented. "If you were trying to be facetious," she said, "I should prefer you to exercise your facetiousness on my guests rather than on my maids. Miss Warren will give you some tea." Mrs. Albert Forrester dismissed me with a wave of the hand, but she did not dismiss the subject, since for the next 2 or 3 years, whenever she introduced me to someone, she never failed to add, "You must make the most of him. He only comes here as a penance. When he comes to the door, he always asks, 'Is there divine service today?' So amusing, isn't he?" But Mrs. Albert Forrester did not confine herself to weekly tea parties. Every Saturday she gave a luncheon of 8 persons, this, according to her opinion, being the perfect number for general conversation, and her dining room conveniently holding no more. If Mrs. Albert Forrester flattered herself upon anything, it was not that her knowledge of English prosody was unique, but that her luncheons were celebrated. She chose her guests with care, and an invitation to one of them was more than a compliment. It was a consecration. Over the luncheon table, it was possible to keep the conversation on a higher level than in the mixed company of a tea party, and few can have left her dining room without taking away with them an enhanced belief in Mrs. Albert Forrester's ability and a brighter faith in human nature. She only asked men, since, stout enthusiast for her sex as she was, and glad to see women on other occasions, she could not but realize that they were inclined at table to talk exclusively to their next-door neighbours, and thus hinder the great exchange of ideas that made her own parties an entertainment not only of the body, but of the soul. I don't know. I'm a bit of a mess today. Lipstick smushing everywhere. I don't know what that's about. Upset tummy, but that's because I had the most delectable cheese, so I'm paying the price. And I'm rather tired, but that'll be, a lactose spike as well. Oh dear goddess. How to stay alive at Sacred Space Titania's realm. One moment at a time. One day at a time. Welcome to paradise. Well, at least the sewer's fixed. They came this morning, woke me up actually. It wasn't an unreasonable hour, it was 10 to 9. But anyway, I was sleeping because I was exhausted. And, they woke me up and told me they'd fixed everything, which I was very pleased about. So, where were we? Carrying on. Carrying on, people of Earth. For it must be said that Mrs. Albert Forrester gave you uncommonly good food, excellent wine, and a first-rate cigar. Now, to anyone who has partaken of literary hospitality, this must appear very remarkable, since literary persons, for the most part, think highly and live plainly. Their minds are occupied with the things of the spirit, and they do not notice that the roast mutton is underdone and the potatoes cold. The beer is all right, but the wine has a sobering effect, and it is unwise to touch the coffee. Mrs. Albert Forrester was pleased enough to receive compliments on the fare she provided, I need to get in the sun. I'm cold now. By the gods. What are we going to do, Kermie? What are we going to do? If people do me the honour to break bread with me, she said, it is only fair that I should give them as good food as they can get at home. But if the flattery was excessive, she deprecated it. You really embarrass me when you give me a meed of praise that is not my due. You must praise Mrs. Bullfinch. Who is Mrs. Bullfinch? My cook. She's a treasure then, but you're not going to ask me to believe that she's responsible for the wine. Is it good? I'm terribly ignorant of such things. I put myself entirely in the hands of my wine merchant. But if mention was made of the cigars, Mrs. Albert Forrester beamed. Ah, for them you must compliment Albert. It is Albert who chooses the cigars, and I am given to understand that no one knows more about a cigar than Albert. She looked at her husband, who sat at the end of the table, with the proud bright eyes of a pedigree hen, a buff Orpington for choice, looking at her only chick. Then there was a quick flutter of conversation as the guests, anxious to be civil to their host and relieved at length to find an occasion, expressed their appreciation of his peculiar merit. You're very kind, he said. I'm glad you like them. Then he would give a little discourse on cigars, explaining the excellencies he sought and regretting the deterioration in quality which had followed on the commercialization of the industry. Mrs. Albert Forrester listened to him with a complacent smile, and it was plain that she enjoyed this little triumph of his. Of course, you cannot go on talking of cigars indefinitely, and as soon as she perceived that her guests were growing restive, she broached a topic of more general, and it may be of more significant interest. Albert subsided into silence, but he had his moment. It was Albert who made Mrs. Forrester's luncheons to some less attractive than her tea parties, for Albert was a bore. But, though without doubt perfectly conscious of the fact, she made a point that he should come to them, and in fact had fixed upon Saturdays for the rest of the week he was busy, in order that he should be able to. Mrs. Albert Forrester felt that her husband's presence on these festive occasions was an unavoidable debt that she paid to her own self-respect. She would never by negligence admit to the world that she had married a man who was not spiritually her equal, and it may be that in the silent watches of the nights she asked herself where indeed such could have been found. Mrs. Albert Forrester's friends were troubled by no such reticence, and they said it was dreadful that such a woman should be burdened with such a man. They asked each other how she had ever come to marry him, and, being mostly celibate, answered despairingly that no one ever knew why anybody married anybody else. It was not that Albert was a verbose and aggressive bore. He did not buttonhole you with interminable stories or pester you with pointless jokes. He did not crucify you on a platitude or hamstring you with a commonplace. He was just dull, a cipher. Clifford Boylston, for whom the French romantics had no secrets, and who was himself a writer of merit, had said that when you looked into a room into which Albert had just gone, there was nobody there. This was thought very clever by Mrs. Albert Forrester's friends, and Rose Waterford, the well-known novelist and the most fearless of women, had ventured to repeat it to Mrs. Albert Forrester. Though she pretended to be annoyed, she had not been able to prevent the smile that rose to her lips. Her behaviour towards Albert could not but increase the respect in which her friends held her. She insisted that whatever in their secret hearts they thought of him, they should treat him with the decorum that was due to her husband. Her own demeanour was admirable. If he chanced to make an observation, she listened to him with a pleasant expression. And when he fetched her a book that she wanted, or gave her his pencil to make a note of an idea that had occurred to her, she always thanked him, nor would she allow her friends pointedly to neglect him. And though, being a woman of tact, she saw that it would be asking too much of the world if she took him about with her always, and she went out much alone. Yet her friends knew that she expected them to ask him to dinner at least once a year. He always accompanied her to public banquets when she was going to make a speech, and if she delivered a lecture, she took care that he should have a seat on the platform. Albert was, I believe, of average height, but perhaps because you never thought of him except in connection with his wife of imposing dimensions, you only thought of him as a little man. He was spare and frail and looked older than his age. This was the same as his wife's. His hair, which he kept very short, was white and meagre. He wore a stubby white moustache. His was a face thin and lined, without a noticeable feature, and his blue eyes, which once might have been attractive, were now pale and tired. He was always very neatly dressed in pepper and salt trousers, which he chose always of the same pattern, a black coat and a grey tie with a small pearl pin in it. He was perfectly unobtrusive, and when he stood in Mrs. Albert Forrester's drawing-room to receive the guests whom she had asked to luncheon, you noticed him as little as you noticed the quiet and gentlemanly furniture. He was well-mannered, and it was with a pleasant, courteous smile that he shook hands with them. "How do you do? I'm very glad to see you," he said, if they were friends of some standing. "Keeping well, I hope." But if they were strangers of distinction coming for the first time to the house, he went to the door as they entered the drawing-room and said, "I am Mrs. Albert Forrester's husband. I will introduce you to my wife." Then he led the visitor to where Mrs. Albert Forrester stood with her back to the light, and she, with a glad and eager gesture, advanced to make the stranger welcome. It was agreeable to see the demure pride he took in his wife's literary reputation, and the self-effacement with which he furthered her interests. He was always there when he was wanted, and never when he wasn't. His tact, if not deliberate, was instinctive. Mrs. Albert Forrester was the first to acknowledge his merits. "I really don't know what I should do without him," she said. "He's invaluable to me. I read him everything I write, and his criticisms are often very useful." "Molière and his cook," said Miss Waterford. "Is that funny, dear Rose?" asked Mrs. Forrester, somewhat acidly. When Mrs. Albert Forrester did not approve of a remark, she had a way that put many persons to confusion of asking whether it was a joke which she was too dense to see, but it was impossible to embarrass Miss Waterford. She was a lady who, in the course of a long life, had had many affairs, but only one passion, and this was for printer's ink. Mrs. Albert Forrester tolerated rather than approved her. "Come, come, my dear," she replied. "You know very well that he wouldn't exist without you. He wouldn't know us. It must be wonderful to him to come in contact with all the best brains and the most distinguished people of our day. It may be that the bee would perish without the hive which shelters it, but the bee nevertheless has a significance of its own." And since Mrs. Albert Forrester's friends, they knew all about art and literature, knew little about natural history, they had no reply to this observation. Witty. She went on. "He doesn't interfere with me. He knows subconsciously when I don't want to be disturbed, and indeed, when I'm following out a train of thought, I find his presence in the room a comfort rather than a hindrance to me." "Like a Persian cat," said Miss Waterford. "But like a very well-trained, well-bred, and well-mannered Persian cat," answered Mrs. Forrester severely, thus putting Miss Waterford in her place. But Mrs. Albert Forrester had not finished with her husband. "We who belong to the intelligentsia," she said, "are apt to live in a world too exclusively our own. We are interested in the abstract rather than in the concrete, and sometimes I think that we survey the bustling world of human affairs in too detached a manner and from too serene a height. Do you not think that we stand in danger of becoming a little inhuman? I shall always be grateful to Albert, because he keeps me in contact with the man in the street." It was on account of this remark, to which none of her friends could deny the rare insight and subtlety that characterized so many of her utterances, that for some time Albert was known in her immediate circle as the man in the street. But this was only for a while, and it was forgotten. He then became known as the philatelist. It was Clifford Boylston, with his wicked wit who invented that name. One day, his poor brain, exhausted by the effort to sustain a conversation with Albert, he had asked in desperation, "Do you collect stamps?" "No," answered Albert mildly. "I'm afraid I don't." But Clifford Boylston had no sooner asked the question than he saw its possibilities. He had written a book on Baudelaire's aunt by marriage, which had attracted the attention of all who were interested in French literature, and was well known in his exhaustive studies of the French spirit to have absorbed a good share of the Gallic quickness and the Gallic brilliancy. He paid no attention to Albert's disclaimer, but at the first opportunity informed I shouldn't laugh. Oh, what a bastard. It's kind of funny though. Informed Mrs. Albert Forrester's friends that he had at last discovered Albert's secret. He collected stamps. He never met him afterwards without asking him, "Well, Mr. Forrester, how is the stamp collection?" Or, "Have you been buying any stamps since I saw you last?" It mattered little that Albert continued to deny that he collected stamps. Oh, dear goddess. The invention was too apt not to be made the most of. Mrs. Albert Forrester's friends insisted that he did, and they seldom spoke to him without asking him how he was getting on. Even Mrs. Albert Forrester, when she was in a specially gay humour, would sometimes speak of her husband as the philatelist. Oh, that's delightful. It's better than being a philaterist, isn't it? Dear goddess. Oh yes, we had to go there, but you know, 'tis the nature of the species to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune and to sycophantically slither their way up the class status struggle, you understand. Oh, we'll sit with the birdies and watch them fantasize about killing each other instead, shall we? We've got my little friends here. My little friend, the butcher bird. He loves me, that bird. Someone loves me. Someone. Little birdies. It's all very sweet. Anyway, where were we? The name really did seem to fit Albert like a glove. Sometimes they spoke of him thus to his face, and they could not but appreciate the good nature with which he took it. He smiled unresentfully, and presently did not even protest that they were mistaken. Of course, Mrs. Albert Forrester had too keen a social sense to jeopardise the success of her luncheons by allowing her more distinguished guests to sit on either side of Albert. She took care that only her older and more intimate friends should do this, and when the appointed victims came in, she would say to them, "I know you won't mind sitting by Albert, will you?" They would only say that they would be delighted, but if their faces too plainly expressed their dismay, she would pat their hands playfully and add, "Next time you shall sit by me. Albert is so shy with strangers, and you know so well how to deal with him." They did. They simply ignored him. So far as they were concerned, the chair in which he sat might as well have been empty. Just seeing how many pages this one. I should check before I start these videos, shouldn't I? Yes, Kermie? Oh, yes, my boy. There was no sign that it annoyed him to be taken no notice of by persons who, after all, were eating food he paid for, since the earnings of Mrs. Forrester could certainly not have provided her guests with spring salmon and forced asparagus. He sat quiet and silent, and if he opened his mouth, it was only to give a direction to one of the maids. If a guest were new to him, he would let his eyes rest on him in a stare that would have been embarrassing if it had not been so childlike. Right, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to move us further into the sun because it's cold. It's cold out of the sun. Right, let's move you over, little bow. Just going to move this table over as well. There we go. We're going to move the book over here and the iPhone over here and all the other plates and things. Not sure. Put it on the chair. Lovely Kirby. Really moving over in the sunlight. Good boy. In the sun we go. I know. Oh. That's better, isn't it? You can live the vida loca. Right, that's lovely. Oh, and you get a good view of the lovely blue skies. And we all live happily ever after. Right. Oh, your table's a bit wobbly, Kermie boy. That's better. Right, we'll continue reading, my wonderful YouTube audience. Sitting out in the garden in Brisbane, Australia, living our best lives, are we right? Oh, honestly, I don't feel well today, but, well, self-inflicted. Self-inflicted by bad, well, very delicious food. I was trying to remember when I ate it. Was a couple of nights ago. So it's annoying, very annoying, because I thought I got away with it. Anyway, where were we? All right. Staring at guests that would have been embarrassing if it had not been so childlike. He seemed to be asking himself what this strange creature was. Just move us slightly. Move us slightly. In an angle. There we go. But what answer his mild scrutiny gave him, he never revealed. When the conversation grew animated, he would look from one speaker to the other, but again you could not tell from his thin, lined face What, he thought, of the fantastic notions that were bandied across the table? Clifford Boylston said that all the wit and wisdom he heard passed over his head like water over a duck's back. Oh, Mr. Crow, what did you do that for? There's no food there. Go on your way. Anarchy and chaos, honestly. So I'll repeat that. He had given up trying to understand and now only made a semblance of listening. But Harry Oakland, the versatile critic, said that Albert was taking it all in. He found it all too marvellous. And with his poor, muddled brain, he was trying desperately to make head or tail of the wonderful things he heard. Of course, in the city, he must boast of the distinguished persons he knew. Perhaps there he was a light of learning and letters, an authority on the ideal. It would be perfectly fine to hear what he made of it all. Harry Oakland was one of Mrs. Albert Forrester's staunchest admirers, and had written a brilliant and subtle essay on her style. With his refined and even beautiful features, he looked like a San Sebastian who had had an accident with a hair restorer, for he was uncommonly hirsute. He was a very young man, not 30, but he had been in turn a dramatic critic and a critic of fiction, a musical critic and a critic of painting. But he was getting a little tired of art and threatened to devote his talents in future to the criticism of sport. Albert, I should explain, was in the city, and it was a misfortune that Mrs. Forrester's friends thought she bore with meritorious fortitude that he was not even rich. There would have been something romantic in it if he had been a merchant prince who held the fate of nations in his hand, or sent argosies laden with rare spices to those ports of the Levant, the names of which have provided many a poet with so rich and rare a rhyme. But Albert was only a current merchant. It was supposed to make no more than just enabled Mrs. Albert Forrester to conduct her life with distinction and even with liberality. Since his occupation kept him in his office till 6 o'clock, he never managed to get to Mrs. Albert Forrester's Tuesdays till the most important visitors were gone. By the time he arrived, there was seldom more than 3 or 4 of her more intimate friends in the drawing room, discussing with freedom and humour the guests who had departed, and when they heard Albert's key in the front door, they realised with one accord that it was late. In a moment he opened the door in his hesitating way and looked mildly in. Mrs. Albert Forrester greeted him with a bright smile. "Come in, Albert, come in. I think you know everybody here." Albert entered and shook hands with his wife's friends. "Have you just come from the city?" she asked eagerly, though she knew there was nowhere else he could have come from. "Would you like a cup of tea?" "No, thank you, my dear. I had tea in my office." Mrs. Albert Forrester smiled still more brightly, and the rest of the company thought she was perfectly wonderful with him. "Ah, but I know you like a second cup. I will pour it out for you myself." She went to the tea table, and forgetting that the tea had been stewing for an hour and a half and was stone cold, poured him out a cup and added milk and sugar. Albert took it with a word of thanks and meekly stirred it, but when Mrs. Forrester resumed the conversation which his appearance had interrupted, without tasting it, put it quietly down. His arrival was the signal for the party finally to break up, and one by one the remaining guests took their departure. On one occasion, however, the conversation was so absorbing and the point at issue so important that Mrs. Albert Forrester would not hear of their going. "It must be settled once and for all, and after all," she remarked in a manner that for her was almost arch. "This is a matter on which Albert may have something to say. Let us have the benefit of his opinion." It was when women were beginning to cut their hair, and the subject of discussion was whether Mrs. Albert Forrester should or should not shingle. Mrs. Albert Forrester was a woman of authoritative presence. She was large-boned, and her bones were well covered. Had she not been so tall and strong, it might have suggested itself to you that she was corpulent. But she carried her weight gallantly. Her features were a little larger than life-size, and it was this that gave her face, doubtless, the look of virile intellectuality that it certainly possessed. Her skin was dark, and you might have thought that she had in her veins some trace of Levantine blood. She admitted that she could not but think there was in her a gypsy strain, and that would account, she felt, for the wild and lawless passion that sometimes characterized her poetry. Her eyes were large and black and bright, her nose like the great Duke of Wellington's, but more fleshy, and her chin square and determined. She had a big mouth with full red lips, which owed nothing to cosmetics. 4 of these Mrs. Albert Forrester had never deigned to make use, and her hair, thick, solid, and grey, was piled on top of her head in such a manner as to increase her already commanding height. She was in appearance an imposing, not to say an alarming, female. I'm just going to have to excuse myself again. I may cut this video into 2 parts too, because I'm filming on my iPhone and I have trouble uploading to YouTube if it's too long. So I think we'll just cut it here, and I'll come back to you after my little break and for part 2. So bye for now. I'll be back forthwith.